Hi again, everybody. In this set of slides, we'll be talking about rent seeking. If you haven't already, you should go have a look at Mike Munger's really fascinating video on the cost of giving money away, or rent seeking. I've got the link here. The link should be available in the content page of your D2L course shell. Okay, have you seen the video? Let's move forward. Why does Mike Munger think that lobbying groups and special interests are a problem? Why does he think that why did he seem to have a negative view of these things? I'll give you a minute to think about it. All right. Well, his view is essentially that interest groups, special interests, waste resources on rent seeking. And of course, by wasting sometimes more resources than are gained by giving away the benefit, rent seeking turns something that's potentially advantageous to society into something that seems to cost society money. His view seems to be that resources spent on organizing and mobilizing people into rent seeking competitions are a kind of waste. Now, his view is not that all competition is wasteful, right? Some forms of market competition are clearly good because they substitute for other forms of regulation of the marketplace. If competition is not regulating the marketplace, then presumably government has to step in to make sure that consumers aren't being mistreated. But some kinds of competition, particularly non-market competition, can be non-productive. And they aren't unproductive because money wouldn't be better spent in the hands of Peter than having it in Paul's hands. They're unproductive because the resources spent trying to acquire the money are greater than the benefit of redistributing it, right? So the idea is that society as a whole becomes poorer by permitting these competitions. Because although giving the money away in theory is great, in practice, people compete for it and people spend resources, and indeed they spend too many resources as a group on acquiring the money than really is up for grabs in the first place. In fact, offering up a government contract or a grant can actually create a collective dilemma where there wasn't one before. In other words, you should look at this like any other collective action problem. Perfectly rational individuals, each pursuing their self-interest, completely rationally, can nonetheless produce an outcome collectively that is irrational from the standpoint of the group. That is to say, the group as a whole is worse off because each individually pursued their rational self-interest. Now, someone won the competition and they're better off, but the point is that society as a whole is worse off. In other words, you could think that from the individual's point of view, their best strategy, given a certain odds, is to spend X dollars to get a benefit of a certain size. But the best strategy for the group as a whole, for N people, is not to spend N X dollars, right? N being the number of people and X being the number of dollars spent per person, right? If that NX is larger than the benefit itself, then from the point of view of society, money has been wasted, even though from the point of view of for each individual, that expenditure of resources is perfectly rational. So usually we would think that government exists, at least in part, to solve these collective action problems. To make us better off rather than to create them and make us worse off. So this is kind of a paradoxical, counterintuitive result. We try to give money away and we end up making ourselves worse off by giving money away, even to very worthy causes, right? Munger's argument does not depend on the cause being particularly worthy or not. The argument just depends on how many resources are spent by people trying to acquire this benefit, right? That's all that matters. So, for instance, the cause could be very worthy. It could be poverty relief of some sort. But if a whole bunch of poverty relief organizations spend tons and tons of money to campaign against poverty more than the benefit that they end up getting is worth, then that will be bad from the point of view of society. Some poverty would get relieved, but note that we would all be much poorer as a result. Okay, Now, in fairness, there doesn't seem to be a hard and fast rule about when it's not worth it or when it's worth it for society to try to give money away, right? Munger doesn't give us a magic formula to say, well, under these circumstances, we should permit rent-seeking competition, and under these circumstances, we shouldn't. But what the logic of rent-seeking tells us is that interest group competition costs real resources, right? It costs money. It costs us money to give money away. Not just the money that we give away that we have to tax. Usually we have to tax it, but or borrow. But on top of that, the cost that people spend trying to get that money. And those costs, those resources that people spend hiring lobbying firms, they spend them advocating in various forums, hiring public policy analysts to do complex cost benefit analysis, hiring economists to try and show that it would be better as a whole for the country to give money to them rather than to someone else. All these resources that are spent in the process of interest group competition, from the point of view of society, when taken together, might outstrip the benefit that is being given away. But even if it doesn't, even if on the whole it's better to do it, those are still real resources lost, which we can lament as having been lost. All right, so that's Mike Munger's point of view, but it's also worth noting that the measure of how well off a society isn't solely a function of its total wealth or income, right? So presumably it's not just the total amount of wealth that matters, but it's the distribution of that wealth, or at least at some level the distribution of that wealth matters a little bit, right? So if 5% of the population owns 95% of the wealth in a country, we might think that there's something gone awry about the situation. So even if it's the case that real resources are wasted in the sense that overall the society as a whole, its GDP, its gross domestic product, right, the sum of all its income in a given year would have been higher without the transfer being done, we might still say that the society is better off with a lower GDP, might be better off with a lower GDP as long as that GDP is more fairly or more productively allocated in some way. Still, I think Munger's point is valuable, even if all that matters isn't total GDP. Given that we sometimes want to give money away, we should probably try to do so in the most efficient way possible. We should pay attention when we try to give money away. We should pay attention to the incentives that we set up, the rent-seeking competitions that we might be setting up when we do give money away. In other words, if we have a choice between making society equally well off for more money and equally well off for less money, we should, all in all, try to save that money. That's something that I think everybody, at the end of the day, can probably agree on.